The Hobbit is one of the most beloved children's stories of all time, but even grown-ups might have a few questions left unanswered. Why can trolls talk? Who is Beorn? And why do the eagles always save the day? Keep watching to find out. One of the strangest things about The Hobbit is the way that it presents dwarves and elves. The dwarves are seen as bumbling yet tragic heroes, trying desperately to overcome impossible odds to recover their home. Sure, they're willing to send a hobbit in to do the dirty work, but overall, Thorin and company are a fairly civil lot. In comparison, many of the story's encounters with the elves tend to portray them as anything but friendly.
What is this horrid creature? A goblin mutant.
That's my wee lad, Gimli.
In The Lord of the Rings, many of these opinions are reversed. Dwarves are seen as decent enough, but elves are shown in a very positive light indeed. The author is the same in both cases, so what gives? Did Tolkien change his mind about the two races between books? While Tolkien's world was always evolving, the answer has more to do with perspective than outright change. Each of Tolkien's books is very deliberately written in a certain way. In fact, at the end of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo gives the so-called Red Book of Westmarch to Sam, which contains two stories, The Lord of the Rings and There and Back Again. The latter, written by Bilbo Baggins, is essentially the story of The Hobbit. Bilbo's perspective of dwarves came from an experience in which he certainly noticed their flaws, but one that was also steeped in their own cultural and political viewpoints. Frodo had some interactions with dwarves, but definitely venerated the elves, whom he interacted with often, and so the two hobbits' perspectives shine through in each of their stories. Compared to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit is a very light-hearted story. In fact, it's generally pretty silly, goofy, and totally family-friendly. In contrast, The Lord of the Rings is a serious, sad, and adult story with many themes that are far too intense for children. So why the difference? Well, Tolkien himself has the answer to this. In a letter to his publisher, he wrote, "The generally different tone and style of The Hobbit is due, in point of genesis, to it being taken by me as a matter from the great cycle susceptible of treatment as a fairy story for children." In another letter written to a friend, Tolkien addresses the subject of tone yet again by saying that The Hobbit was unhappily really meant, as far as I was conscious, as a children's story. It has some of the silliness of manner caught unthinkingly from the kind of stuff I had had served to me. I deeply regret them. So do intelligent children. The distinct difference in tone between each story is very real, and even the author was aware of the change, to the point that he outright regretted it. When Tolkien went to write a sequel to The Hobbit, he settled on the One Ring as the connection point between the two stories. This led to a lot of subsequent character development and a few adjustments to the original story. For example, the mysterious Necromancer character from The Hobbit was chosen to play a much bigger role in the new story. Of course, that character is Sauron. But what is he doing in Mirkwood in a ghostly, non-physical form during the events of The Hobbit? The answer lies in Tolkien's personal obsession with world-building. By the time The Hobbit was published, the author had already been working on what would eventually become the Silmarillion for 2 previous decades, in fact. And when he actually sat down to write The Hobbit, he found that his then-private Silmarillion world began to encroach on the story of Bilbo Baggins. In one letter, Tolkien says that Mr. Baggins began as a comic tale among conventional and inconsistent Grimm's fairy tale dwarves, and got drawn into the edge of it, so that even Sauron the Terrible peeped over the edge. Trolls are a fascinating aspect of Middle-earth's history. In a letter written 17 years after the release of The Hobbit, Tolkien addresses the troll conundrum, saying simply, "I'm not sure about trolls." There are many different versions of these underdeveloped creatures found in Tolkien's work, from hill trolls to cave trolls to Olog-hai, the fierce breed of orc-like trolls that appear in the appendix to The Return of the King. The appendices also suggest that very few of these trolls actually speak, stating, "In their beginning, these creatures were of dull and lumpish nature and had no more language than beasts. But Sauron had made use of them, teaching them what little they could learn, and increasing their wits with wickedness." In that aforementioned letter, Tolkien breaks down the idea that trolls are likely only counterfeits, essentially that they were made in mockery of the Ents. Tolkien subsequently explains that while trolls may be able to talk, they are generally animalistic in nature. But where do the trolls from The Hobbit fit into all this? They have very English names, they live a somewhat civil lifestyle, and they can easily talk.
What are you then? An oversized squirrel?
I'm a burglar. Hobbit.
Burglar Hobbit?
Well, it turns out that the only trolls who are mentioned in the appendices as being particularly articulate are the stone trolls, who apparently spoke a debased form of the common speech. Even then, this is another area in which Tolkien's opinions changed a lot over time. And yes, unfortunately, that means there's no solid answer to this one. Giants are rare and mystical creatures, even for Middle-earth. They're mentioned throughout The Lord of the Rings, but only in passing. In The Return of the King, Minas Tirith is described as looking as if it had been built by giants out of the stones of the earth. In The Hobbit, they're brought up as creatures in many of Gandalf's stories, and Bilbo thinks of them as a potential answer during his riddle game with Gollum. And then, of course, there's that time when Bilbo, Gandalf, and the dwarves travel over the Misty Mountains and see some real stone giants during a thunderstorm. The stone giants cause a considerable ruckus, laughing and throwing rocks at each other, and then proceed to never be a viable presence in anything else that Tolkien ever writes. This one's tough, since Tolkien himself seems to have done a 180 on giants in his world. Indeed, there are many other fairly well-developed forms of giants to be found in the earlier versions of Tolkien's mythos, but over time, the author appears to have toned down his interest in that race, to the point where they don't feature heavily in any of his other works. Gollum is an odd one. He lives alone, obsesses over his ring, and loves to snack on any living thing that happens to wander near his home. So why, when Bilbo shows up, is Gollum's first thought to start a game of riddles with his new acquaintance?
Games? Oh, we love games, doesn't we, Precious? Does it like games? Does it like to play?
Well, first off, Bilbo has a sword, and when Gollum sees Sting, he makes sure to be very polite, until he figures out just who this little hobbit is, at least. But that still leaves another question. Why riddles? Why wouldn't he just chat with Bilbo? Or stalk him, or even sit there and watch him? It turns out that Tolkien answers this one via a quick, easy-to-miss line in The Hobbit. Just before the game begins, the book reads, "Riddles were all Gollum could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago." This isn't just a random interest either, as riddles are clearly taken very seriously in Middle-earth. After the game, it becomes clear that Bilbo knows that the riddle game is sacred to many, and that even someone like Gollum would be afraid to cheat at one. In other words, riddles aren't just a passing fancy for the peoples of Middle-earth. They're a very serious matter indeed. The Hobbit is full of incredible beasts and creatures, and one of the most remarkable of all is Beorn, the Skin Changer. In the Hobbit novel, it's implied that there are many other bear-to-human creatures like him, too. So what's the origin of this strange group, and where do shapeshifters fit into Tolkien's world? Unfortunately, this is another area in which the author left little more than hints and riddles. As far as the ability to change shapes goes, that's nothing new in Middle-earth. The angelic Valar and Maiar take on physical forms all the time, and in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf describes Radagast as, quote, a master of shapes and changes of hue. Even Sauron turns into a werewolf, a serpent, and a vampire bat in the Silmarillion. But for all that shifting and changing, Beorn's specific race of skin changers remains highly mysterious. All we get is Gandalf's initial description of the fellow in The Hobbit, which reads, "Some say that he is a bear, descendant from the great and ancient bears of the mountains that lived there before the giants came. Others say that he is a man descended from the first men who lived before Smaug or the other dragons came into this part of the world, and before the goblins came into the hills out of the north." While Gandalf isn't sure himself, he apparently favors the second option, but as he himself also says about the matter, "I cannot tell you much more though, that ought to be enough." If you've read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, you might be wondering how far the 7 Dwarven Rings are involved with Bilbo's adventures. After all, The Hobbit features the Arkenstone, which is a super jewel with its own inner power. The Silmarillion also explains that. The foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring, but all those hordes long ago were plundered and the dragons devoured them. It would seem natural, then, to suggest that the Lonely Mountain might have been home to one of those hordes. So, Is there a Dwarven Ring lying at the heart of the mountain, or possibly in Smaug's belly? As it turns out, no, but kind of. See, the Lonely Mountain is originally founded by some of the dispossessed dwarves who are driven out of Moria by the Balrog. Long before that point, one of their kings receives one of the 7 Dwarven Rings, and it stays in the family until Thorin's father loses it when he's captured by the Necromancer. So, while there isn't a Dwarven Ring present in Erebor when Bilbo arrives on the scene, one of the Rings of Power is likely responsible for the mass of gold and treasure on which Smaug sleeps.
Eagles! The eagles are coming!
You've probably noticed that eagles play an important role in Tolkien's world. They save Bilbo, Gandalf, and the dwarves from the clutches of the orcs of the Misty Mountains. They show up to help turn the tide during the Battle of the Five Armies. Their leader, Gwaihir, the Windlord, saves Gandalf when he's trapped on Orthanc, and his eagles swoop in to join in the battle at the Black Gate of Mordor too. Eagles also save the day multiple times during the Silmarillion. So, what's up with the eagles always arriving in the nick of time? Is it a cop-out or a lazy excuse to resolve a story? Nope. Tolkien's use of the eagles to provide dramatic savior-like moments is something that he developed specifically and intentionally. In fact, he coined a term for this plot device, a eucatastrophe. In Tolkien's famous essay on fairy stories, the author points out that while drama and tragedy go hand in hand, fairy stories must come with a consolation or happy ending. In a letter written to his son Christopher, the author defines the concept of a eucatastrophe as the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears, which I argued is the highest function of fairy stories to produce. When writing fantasy, Tolkien felt that the story must provide these moments of grace and salvation, and the majestic eagles remained one of his favorite ways of doing so. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.